So when I posted my DJI Air 3S first flight video, I got a bunch of comments, something along the lines of the Air 3S is a disaster, camera quality is no good, a bunch of problems, etc, etc. And the two main things that they were talking about was, number one, that DJI apparently cut the maximum bit rate or data rate of the Air 3S's footage, allegedly making the footage way worse quality than the Air 3, and that the full advertised 14 stops of dynamic range is only available in auto exposure mode. So I decided to put those claims to the test and see if DJI has completely destroyed the Air 3S and made it unusable, or if in spite of the claimed taking away features and going backwards, it's actually still better. I honestly didn't know. I wouldn't be surprised if DJI just made some big mistakes with the Air 3S. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And folks, I have the receipts, I did the tests, and I have a definitive answer on whether the Air 3S is a step forward or a step backwards from the Air 3. Oh, and by the way, before we go any further, I should mention this video is not sponsored by DJI. They did not send me the drone. I bought it myself with my own hard-earned money. So this video is completely unbiased. First up, we have the claim that the bitrate is lower on the Air 3S than on the Air 3, and that this makes the footage lower quality. Now, just on the surface of things, yes, the Air 3S does have a lower bitrate at the same settings than the Air 3. If we open both files up in QuickTime, both shot in 4K at 60 frames per second in 10-bit log. The file from the Air 3 has a bitrate of 129 megabits per second, and the corresponding file from the Air 3S has a bit rate of only 89 megabits per second, or only about 2/3 the bit rate of the Air 3. But the question is, does this actually make a difference? And if you aren't familiar with what bit rate is, it's basically how much data per second of video the drone writes to the SD card, or in other words, how big the file is for the same length of a video. And in general, a bigger file, a higher bit rate is going to be higher quality because the video isn't being compressed down as much and not as much data is being thrown away, and so therefore you get higher quality. But this isn't necessarily universally the case. It definitely does depend on what format it's being compressed into and the specific compression algorithm. Both of these files are using H.265 compression, so you certainly would expect that the file with lower bit rate would have worse quality. But is that actually the case? One of the comments on my video said that the Air 3S was way less detailed than the Air 3. So I set up a test to compare them. I had them side by side shooting at this tree with a fairly complex pattern of leaves, which is something that is generally really hard on compression algorithms. And if we switch back and forth between the Air 3S and the Air 3, you can see that the Air 3S is at least as detailed. It actually looks like it has a fair bit more fine detail than the Air 3, and I think that's because it has a larger sensor, and generally a larger sensor produces more detailed footage, but it certainly doesn't appear that the Air 3S is less detailed than the Air 3. And same thing looking at some more clean lined simple subjects instead of a pattern, you can see here even more clearly that the Air 3S is far more detailed than the Air 3. So as far as detail, the Air 3S is still pulling out ahead despite having a smaller bitrate. Now, the other thing you might be wondering is, does the lower bitrate impact color grading flexibility and how much banding you get in smooth color transition areas, like for example in a blue sky? And that is a great question. So here I have identical shots from the Air 3S and Air 3 again shot in D-Log-M in 4K at 60 frames per second, and I have graded them, added a bunch of saturation and contrast, and then used HSL curves to darken down the blues, which is something that will classically break drone footage and cause banding in the sky. And if we look at our Air 3 shot, you can see that there is quite a bit of noise and basically banding going on in the sky here. But if we come over here to our Air 3S, as you can see, it is far cleaner and there isn't really any significant banding. Now, this might be because there's just more noise reduction going on the Air 3S, or it is just less noisy to start with, but I've got to say it's quite impressive. And again, with some shots on a cloudy day, I pushed them way harder than I normally would grading shots just to see where they would break. And as you can see, the Air 3 has some weird colors starting to go on here, some serious banding going on, whereas the Air 3S also has a little bit of banding going on, but a lot less weird colors popping out of nowhere. So I've got to say it's actually apparently better. Now, how did DJI do this? I have no idea. Whatever kind of magic they're using in there to get apparently better quality, or at least as good quality as the Air 3 out of a 1/3 lower bitrate video file, I do not know. But it's pretty awesome, and I'm here for it. Now, is it possible that it does degrade the image quality in some way that I wasn't able to discover in my tests? Yes, that is possible. And I would personally prefer to have whatever fancy compression algorithm they included on the Air 3S along with a higher bitrate, maybe even higher than the Air 3. But I honestly can't complain, and they certainly didn't ruin the Air 3S with this. By the way, if you want to get the most cinematic shots with your Air 3S, Air 3, or just about any other DJI drone for that matter, I've got a couple things that you'll want to check out. First of all, I put together a checklist of the best cinematic settings for the Air 3S for easy reference when you're out shooting. We also have one for the Air 3, and I'm giving away completely for free. Link to download it is in the description. And I also have a completely free 45-minute drone filmmaking training where I share my top 10 secrets to creating cinematic drone videos. Link to that is also down in the description. Anyway, back to the video. Now, the second thing is about the claimed figure of 14 stops dynamic range. Now, I was initially very skeptical of the 14 stops dynamic range figure because camera companies just generally tend to way overstate the dynamic range that their cameras have, and I don't have the fancy equipment required to precisely test dynamic range. But a lot of people were correctly pointing out that on DJI's website it states that you only get the full 14 stops of dynamic range if you are using auto exposure on the Air 3S. And so I tested out to see whether that was actually the case. So is that true? Do you really get less dynamic range if you shoot in manual exposure, which I nearly always do? Well, the answer is yes, it is. You get more dynamic range in auto exposure mode than in manual exposure. And this applies across normal mode, hybrid log gamma, even D-Log M. In all color profiles, you get more dynamic range in auto exposure mode. You can see some examples of D-Log M graded exactly the same. This is in manual mode, and this is in auto exposure mode. You can see that in auto exposure mode, we keep a fair bit more detail in the highlights in the sky around the sun, and the shadows are also brighter as well. And this becomes even more apparent in normal color mode. This is in manual exposure, and this is in auto exposure. Huge difference from most of the sky blown out and can't see hardly any detail down in the shadows of the image to being able to see a little bit more detail in the shadows of the image and having basically the entire sky nicely exposed. Now you might be wondering, how does this compare to the Air 3? Well, starting off in normal color profile, this is what the Air 3S looks like in manual mode, and this is what the Air 3 looks like. The Air 3 definitely boosts the shadows up a little bit more and might be a bit brighter overall. But if we boost up the shadows and pull down the highlights the same for both shots, you can see that we're not really losing any detail in the shadows on the Air 3S, even though they are darker, and it's actually retaining a bit more data in the highlights. So all in all, the dynamic range is pretty similar between the two when they're in manual mode, and you get a significant boost in auto. And same goes for D-Log M, both graded and ungraded. The dynamic range between the Air 3 and the Air 3S is basically identical, with the Air 3S retaining a little bit more detail in the highlights. So there's at least no disadvantage to the Air 3S in manual mode. So what do you do? Should you just throw your drone in auto mode all of the time and not care about trying to use manual settings? Just go with auto for the extra dynamic range? Well, not entirely. There are a couple things to keep in mind here. First of all, it's a fairly small bump in dynamic range that you're not going to notice in a lot of situations. If you're shooting directly into the sun, for example, at sunrise or sunset, like in this situation, it might be worth switching over into auto mode. Now, if you don't want your exposure changing during the shot, you can lock your auto exposure. You can actually map one of the buttons on your remote to do it with just one single button press, and this will mostly lock in the exposure. It won't be entirely locked in. You still have some kind of HDR shifting of the exposure like on the Air 3 in hybrid log gamma mode, but it's not going to be radically changing and will be pretty much locked in. Now, for the rest of the time, when you're just filming a lot lower dynamic range subjects, you actually don't need the extra dynamic range. The dynamic range on the Air 3 was already pretty great, so while it is nice to have an extra bump in dynamic range on the Air 3S in auto mode, for a majority of the shots you're going to be taking, you don't need all all of that dynamic range. So does this mean the Air 3S is destroyed because you have to use auto mode to get the full dynamic range? I would say not at all, because you get just as good dynamic range, maybe even a little bit better than the Air 3 in manual mode, and you do have the option to flip it into auto mode and lock your exposure for those higher contrast scenes like at sunrise and sunset. So there we go, there is the proof, there are the receipts for some of the biggest questions about how the Air 3 stacks up against the Air 3S. All in all, I've got to say I really loved the Air 3S so far. It's basically an Air 3, which I loved the Air 3, with an even better camera strap to it, better in low light, better detail, higher quality photos, better quality on the 3X camera, better pretty much everything in the photo and video department, and not taking away from any of the great features that the Air 3 had. And as always guys, if you want to learn how to get more cinematic shots with your Air 3S or any other DJI drone for that matter, make sure to download your Air 3S settings checklist and make sure to check out my completely free training with my top 10 secrets to cinematic drone shots. Links to all of that is down in the description, or if you want to go even deeper, I have an entire 10-hour drone filmmaking course with over 70 tutorials where I go into every single part of my process for creating drone videos, from the best settings to composition to how to get smooth shots to how to work with natural light to how to edit your videos in both DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro, as well as how to color grade your shots and make them pop in both of those programs. And if you want to check that out, you can go to Flying Filmmaker Pro, or it's also linked down in the description. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more videos just like this, and we'll see you in the next one.